Well, Jessica, thank you for this opportunity and all the hard work you've done to make all this happen in kind of uncertain times. And so, as I jump in to my talk, mixed ancestry from wild and domestic lineages contributes to the rapid expansion of invasive feral swine. I want to first take a moment and acknowledge my co-authors, Mike Tabak, Chris Slotemaker, Mike Robeson, Ryan Miller, Mirj Bosa, Hendrik Jan Meegans, Martin Gronin, Sam Paeva, Danny D. Faria, Harvey Blackburn, Brandon Schmidt, and Tony Piaggio. And this talk really is an opportunity for me to summarize the findings of our recent paper that just came out in Molecular Ecology and begin to interpret, these findings for management applications a bit more, but also build on the data set. So, in the paper, again, published this winter, we had 6,500 animals, and we've since expanded that to 11,500 animals. And so we're getting a fuller and fuller perspective of invasive feral swine throughout the US. And so this audience, I'm sure, is very familiar with all the negative consequences that come with the establishment of invasive feral swine. First and foremost is damage to agricultural systems, row crop agriculture in particular, but also they're recognized as a reservoir for diseases that are of importance for both human health and the health of livestock, and then also the ecological consequences that come with these animals, from depredating sea turtle nests, as shown here, to wallowing behaviors that denude and reconfigure ecosystems and open up habitats for additional invasive species. Similarly, I'm sure the audience is familiar with the rapid expansion of feral swine. So just as recently as the 1980s, we tended to think of feral swine as a management challenge locally restricted to the Southeast, Texas, California. But since that time, it's grown, with populations now established in somewhere between 38 to 40 states. Now, in response to these growing threats, the National Feral Swine Damage Management Program was formed with funds appropriated by Congress in 2014. Although national in scope, the program's focus is to provide an organizational infrastructure to facilitate management action and decision making at state and local levels. And there are some specific objectives that flow from the program: facilitate management efforts, conduct disease surveillance, conduct public outreach, and develop new management tools. Of those new management tools, the development of the feral swine genetic archive was one of them. And so I oversee or manage the feral swine genetic archive, and the archive serves as a physical repository for tissue samples collected from feral swine, overwhelmingly through Wildlife Services control operations. But increasingly, we're transitioning that physical repository to a genetic database. And the archive is held at the National Wildlife Research Center and organized within the Wildlife Genetics Project, supervised by Tony Piaggio. And I work in close collaboration with the National Feral Swine Damage Management Program. So again, as the archive has grown as a physical repository, we hold now over 18,000 samples collected throughout 2014 through the present. And then we've been tasked with converting that physical archive into a database. And the tool of choice has become the GeneSeq Genomic Profiler. It's an Illumina SNP array that returns approximately 68,000 biallelic SNPs available for a whole array of genetic analyses. And again, we've begun to convert those physical samples into data. And we now hold approaching 12,000 genotypes, again, collected throughout the entirety of the invaded range of feral swine, from Hawaii and Guam to Maine, East Coast, California, Texas. If there are established populations, we generally have a sample in the archive. And so the archive provides a unique perspective in both spatial breadth and temporal depth and genetic resolution to characterize the processes that have contributed to this rapid expansion of feral swine. So we sought to leverage those resources to ask a relatively simple question of where did feral swine come from and where are these new populations coming from, and evaluate that question relative to various different ancestral sources. So the narrative is pretty well established at this point that the continental US, has had free-ranging pigs in some capacity for nearly 500 years. The first introductions and establishment of free-ranging pig populations date back to a time of Spanish exploration and shepherded pigs that accompanied Spanish conquistadors as they were exploring, the Florida Peninsula and what would become the southeast of the U.S. From that time forward, we've had some manifestation of free-ranging pig populations. But there's a whole array of other potential sources that may be continuing to contribute to feral swine populations. First, we can think of the emergent locavore movement and an interest in consuming free-range or pasture-raised pigs. Similarly, we could have potential sources from wild boar. So in the 80s, the Canadian government facilitated the establishment of a farm-raised wild boar industry. And since 2005, it's become legal to import wild boar as livestock from Canada for stocking up high fence operations. So we can imagine these wild boar as a potential source. If a fence line in one of those high fence operations should be compromised with a tree falling over or uh, or a flood washing out, we could imagine these genetically pure wild boar escaping from high fence operations. And a third potential source is potbelly pigs. It's from the 80s. Similarly, from the 80s, there's been an interest in raising pigs as a pet. When these pigs are small, they they align pretty nicely with homes, but these animals can grow to be 300 pounds, and we know they find their way out to the wild through varied processes. But nonetheless, these are free-ranging pigs that find their way into wild populations. So we sought to use the unique resources of the archive to identify the relative contributions from historical populations to more contemporary domestic production, wild boar importation, or potentially spillover from the pet industry. So to address this question, we first had to assemble a comprehensive reference set for Sus scrofa. And so we partnered with Harvey Blackburn and his group at USDA Agricultural Research Services, and similarly Martin Gronin and his team of collaborators at Wageningen University to identify and collect genotypes from 132 reference groups. Now, those reference groups represented as comprehensive of a sample of the genetic attributes of Sus scrofa that we could acquire, and they represented Western domestic breeds, European wild boar populations, Asian domestic breeds, Asian wild boar populations, and we also had some sister taxa. Now, for analysis, we used two different approaches. The first was a bit more qualitative, in that we used principal component analysis to visualize the structure and patterns both within the reference data and then how feral swine aligned with that distribution, that diversity captured within the reference set. For a more quantitative approach, we replicated the published methods used by ancestry.com, but simply applied those methods to our uniquely assembled reference group for Sus scrofa. So in alignment with the ancestry.com method, we organized those 132 reference groups, so various breeds, various populations of wild boar, sister taxa, into 17 distinct and discrete genetically cohesive reference groups. We then queried feral swine back against these reference groups to identify the contribution of each of those reference groups to individual feral swine genomes. Okay, again, in the manuscript, we had 6,500 samples, and for the purposes of this talk, we've expanded that to 11,600 samples. So jumping right into some PCA results. So this is the distribution of our reference set. So here we've got Asian domestic breeds to the right and Asian wild boar shown here in shades of pink. And then we've got Western populations here on the left side of the graph. And this aligns with the bifurcation of Sus scrofa with the colonization of the Eurasian supercontinent about 1 million years ago, and the subsequent independent domestication of pigs both within Asia and Europe. And so again, we've got Asian domestic pigs, Asian wild pigs here shown on the right, and then among our Western breeds, we've got heritage pigs, which are a bit closer to European wild boar, and then some more mainstream commercial breeds here, a bit more divergent from European wild boar populations. We can now then overlay feral swine, and we see that feral swine really form a bridge between European wild boar and overwhelmingly heritage pigs. But we do have some associations back with those Asian lineages or with commercial breeds, and that demonstrates the diversity of contributing sources that are augmenting feral swine populations throughout the U.S. Okay, as we move into our more quantitative results, when we look across all animals, all 11,600 animals, we see this admixed signal that represents overwhelmingly or the majority of Western heritage breeds. So these are old breeds that wouldn't be available in mainstream grocery stores, that we would have raised in free range settings, basically from the 1600s through the 1900s. We also see a significant contribution from European wild boar, and with a little bit of Berkshire kind of making up the balance. So again, these are averages represented across all individuals, but when we look at individual feral swine, overwhelmingly they represent or they contain each one of these reference groups, with some contribution from Western heritage breeds, some contribution from European wild boar. These makeups, individual makeups, do vary regionally. So here's a regional map of European wild boar associations, with red being effectively complete association and blue being low association. And so here you can get a perspective of how those associations, genetic associations, vary regionally across the U.S. Now, again, given that European wild boar versus Western heritage breeds make up the vast majority of the genome, you can think of the heritage breeds as just simply the inverse of this map. And so, some important things that might be of interest would be low wild boar associations in Florida, and similarly, the Havasu population in Western Arizona. We also have very high wild boar associations in a couple limited populations: New Hampshire, Vermont, Michigan, and also a small localized introduction into Utah. So those associations appear to align with genetically pure wild boar, whereas the vast majority of pigs across the invaded range really represent a hybrid between Western heritage breeds and European wild boar. So now that we've begun to identify kind of that mixed Western heritage breed plus wild boar as somewhat of the calling card or the genetic characteristic of invasive feral swine throughout the US, we can then begin to classify individuals and then similarly identify levels of augmentation from those discrete ancestral sources that I mentioned previously. So when we classify all 11,600 animals, the vast majority represent this hybrid animals of this hybrid origin, where we see very little or limited contributions directly from domestic pigs. Similarly, little contribution directly from wild boar, so these would be genetically pure wild boar. And then we do see a couple potbellies appear here and there. Again, how they find their way into the wild is still a lingering question, but nonetheless, collectively, these animals represent a small minority, whereas the vast majority of animals represent this hybrid origin of Western heritage breed mixed with European wild boar. So, in leveraging the breadth and depth and the genetic resolution provided by the feral swine genetic archive, we've been able to provide irrefutable evidence that the rapid expansion of invasive feral swine over the past 30 years has been attributable to the expansion of established populations as opposed to novel introduction from either of those three distinct sources. Now, some of that expansion could be consistent with population growth and natural dispersal. However, when those patterns of establishment represent long distance movements from the established range into unoccupied habitat, we have to connect the dots and point to human facilitated translocation and release as being the causative agent in the emergence of those new populations. And again, we're only seeing modest contributions from any one of those distinct lineages of domestic pig, genetically pure wild boar, or potbelly pig. And so This analysis, while it's provided a big picture assessment of what are the drivers of feral swine range expansion, it does have some immediate management implications. And we've begun to use this analysis as a first screening whenever animals are detected outside of the invaded range to give our operators in the field some understanding of what are the drivers contributing to potentially an emergent population. So let me give you one example. We had a sample arrived from Ohio, followed in short succession by a pig from Illinois. Both of these samples were collected adjacent to roads and in areas where feral swine are not known to occur. So running these through the ancestry algorithm, we identified that the Ohio pig was that of heritage makeup, consistent with a genetically pure heritage breed, quite possibly likely straight off the farm, whereas the Illinois pig represented that hybrid makeup of wild boar heritage breed that we've come to recognize as the calling card, if you will, of U.S. feral swine. Now, additional analysis conducted on the Illinois sample demonstrated that the pig originated from a population in southeast Missouri, at least 60 miles away from where it was killed, and across the Mississippi River. So, as we relay this back to managers, both of these animals represent a common management problem. They both represent the potential for property destruction, whether that's row crop agriculture or whether that's personal property, golf courses. Similarly, they represent a reservoir for disease where these pigs are now in an unmanaged state. But while these pigs may represent a common management problem, they offer different management solutions. With the pig in Ohio, we can imagine a local producer that has a leaky fence and very much might prefer to have that pig inside a fence as opposed to dead on a roadside. Whereas in Illinois, it appears that we have a deliberate collection, transportation, and then release of feral swine from one wild population, potentially, presumably, in an attempt to establish another population. So while they represent pigs free ranging on the landscape, they offer very different management solutions. As we get this broader perspective of feral swine and the genetic makeup of feral swine, is posing some really interesting emergent questions. So the historical record, um, eloquently laid out and thoroughly laid out in Maren Brisbane's 1991 book, we have this replete history of domestic pig introductions from cultivated herds into the wild. You know, first with the Spanish exploration, subsequently with free-range livestock practices, and a desire to release pigs into forested ecosystems to fatten in the fall on fallen chestnuts, acorns, hickory nuts. And then that historical record has pockets of wild boar introductions that have been far more limited both in scope and time. But yet when we look across the entirety of feral swine, we see this ubiquitous signal of wild boar association. And so it really poses a very interesting question. Is wild boar ancestry somehow essential for feral swine to become invasive? Or an alternative to that hypothesis would be, is the unique genetic makeup of wild boar domestic pig hybrids somehow particularly invasive? Now, this work is not to say that domestic pigs independently couldn't become invasive. It's just that when we look across the entirety of the US, we don't see much support for populations going from directly from the farm into flourishing, free-ranging, invasive populations. So as we see this shared genetic ancestry across feral swine throughout the entirety of the U.S., it really um, poses the question of what has been the historical influence of those limited wild boar introductions, notably into Hooper Bald, North Carolina, but other wild boar introductions that have been, again, so thoroughly documented in Maren Brisbane 1991. And so for our next steps, now that we've come to characterize the ancestral origins of feral swine as Western heritage breeds and European wild boar, we can look at shifts in the genome of feral swine from either of those two ancestral sources to ask the question of how is invasiveness emerging among feral swine and use that information to begin to curtail their proliferation. So with that, I wanted to thank um, the Feral Swine Damage Management Program for funding. the National Wildlife Research Center, and the National Wildlife Disease Program. I'd also like to acknowledge members of the Feral Swine Genetic Archive team, Anna Mangan and Courtney Pierce. But again, the archive is only attainable with all the hard work that goes into the field from our field operations and their contribution of samples to the archive. So thank you very much, and look forward to hearing questions, presumably by email.